Vietnam is attempting something that most countries do not even try. It wants to force average GDP growth of at least 10% a year from 2026 to 2030. This is not just a hopeful projection from economists or a finance ministry target that might quietly be missed. It is a formal political mandate written into the Communist Party's national plan. And it is tied to a very clear finish line, reaching around $8,500 in GDP per person by 2030. That is an extraordinary goal. In rich economies, 2 or 3% annual growth is considered strong. For developing countries, 5 to 7% over several years is already impressive. But 10% is different. Because of compounding, an economy growing at that pace would roughly double in a little more than 7 years. Vietnam is trying to compress decades of development into one political period. It is trying to move from lower middle-income status into the upper middle-income tier by 2030, with the longer-term goal of becoming a high-income country by 2045. But there is a major problem with setting economic policy by political order. A government can demand growth on paper. It cannot order electricity to appear in a strained power grid. It cannot order foreign governments to keep their markets open. And it cannot instantly turn a cautious bureaucracy into a fast, risk-taking machine. Yet in 2026, Vietnam is trying to do all of these things at once. The reality of the Vietnamese economy is not one simple story of a rising Asian tiger. It is really 3 separate systems moving at the same time and often crashing into one another. First, there is the huge export and factory expansion caused by the global China Plus One shift. Second, there is an overburdened power system struggling to keep up with industrial demand. Third, there is a deliberate state effort to reduce 2 major risks at once: property debt at home and tariff pressure abroad. Vietnam is not starting from zero. That is what makes the 10% target so difficult. Over the last 2 decades, the country has already built one of the most successful industrial growth stories in the developing world. In 2025, its economy grew by 8.02%. Exports reached $475 billion. Of that, $153 billion went to the United States alone. Because Vietnam buys much less from America than it sells there, it ran a trade surplus of nearly $134 billion with the US in a single year. Those numbers show the strength of Vietnam's export machine. But they also show its biggest weakness. When a developing country runs a surplus that large with the United States, Washington notices. American politicians, regulators, and manufacturers start asking hard questions. By 2026, the risk of US retaliation was no longer theoretical. Washington was considering broad tariffs of 20% on Vietnamese goods. Even more dangerous was the threat of a 40% penalty tariff on goods judged to be part of illegal transshipment schemes. That matters because the United States has often not made its exact rules fully clear. Exporters are left guessing where legitimate assembly ends and illegal relabeling begins. That uncertainty is enough to freeze investment decisions and make factories nervous. It wants to become a higher-value manufacturing base for semiconductors, consumer electronics, and electric vehicle parts. It wants to do that without losing the export engine that still provides jobs, tax revenue, and foreign exchange. Investors like the direction, but many analysts and institutions such as the World Bank have warned that a politically ordered 10% growth target is far above what the economy is likely to deliver in reality. Still, in early 2026, the party formally put this target at the center of its 2026 to 2030 plan. Vietnam must become an upper middle-income country by 2030 and a developed, high-income country by 2045. The political message is clear. The harder question is whether the state system can actually deliver it. To understand Vietnam's 2026 strategy, you have to understand the state itself. Land must be cleared, permits must be approved, budgets must be signed, contracts must move through ministries and provincial offices. If those approvals do not happen, growth targets do not matter. That is why Vietnam has been restructuring its government machinery. In 2025, major proposals were pushed forward to merge powerful ministries. The Ministry of Finance was set to absorb the Ministry of Planning and Investment. The Ministry of Construction was to combine with the Ministry of Transport. These are not cosmetic changes. These are giant, bureaucratic engines that manage huge budgets and major national projects. The goal of merging them is simple: reduce overlap, cut layers of approval, and get projects moving faster. There were also major provincial and commune-level reorganizations passed by the National Assembly in 2025. The logic behind all of this is speed. If a project has to pass fewer desks and collect fewer signatures, it gets built faster. And if Vietnam wants double-digit growth, it needs roads, ports, power lines, and industrial parks built quickly. But this push for speed did not come from a healthy starting point. It came from years of paralysis. The main reason was the anti-corruption campaign known as the Blazing Furnace. This campaign punished thousands of officials, executives, and business figures. It raised the cost of corruption dramatically. But it also produced a side effect: fear. Officials became terrified to sign anything. If a procurement deal was later questioned, if a project looked too favorable to one company, or if any financial error appeared in hindsight, careers could be destroyed and prison could follow. So many officials stopped taking risks. They delayed permits. They passed decisions to other departments. They asked for more reviews. They left money unspent because signing off on a project felt more dangerous than doing nothing. This became known as the fear of signing. And it became a real drag on the economy. International donors said Vietnam had lost at least $2.5 billion in foreign aid over several years because projects were frozen by administrative paralysis. Another $1 billion was reportedly sitting there waiting for approvals that nobody wanted to give. The problem was even worse with domestic public spending. Roughly $19 billion of planned public funds reportedly failed to be invested between 2021 and 2023. The money was allocated. The needs were obvious. Roads, bridges, and power projects were waiting. But the state apparatus did not move. That is why the 2025 to 2026 streamlining drive matters so much. It is not just about better management. It is about restarting the state's ability to act. Vietnam cannot hit 10% growth if capital remains trapped in the treasury, while infrastructure projects sit unapproved. This also explains why the government is now leaning so heavily into hard infrastructure. By late 2025, Vietnam had launched 234 major infrastructure projects, with a combined value of around 3,400 trillion dong, or roughly $129.4 billion. That is an enormous amount, equal to roughly a quarter of the country's annual output. Only about 18% of this was directly funded by the state. The rest depended on private and external capital. So the state's strategy is not just to spend. It is to use public action to unlock much larger pools of private money. To help finance the push, the government planned to raise $5.5 billion in foreign loans in 2026 and laid out a new official development assistance strategy that aims to attract up to $38 billion between 2026 and 2030. That is another sign of how serious the state is about turning political mandates into concrete. On paper, the formula sounds simple: merge ministries, cut bureaucracy, unfreeze capital, build infrastructure, stimulate the economy. But it is not that simple. Vietnam quickly runs into two hard limits that no political slogan can remove: the physical limits of electricity and the geopolitical limits of trade. If you want to know why Vietnam is pushing so hard, look at the global factory map. Vietnam has one major advantage that very few countries can copy. Its northern border sits right next to southern China, one of the densest manufacturing ecosystems on Earth. For decades, global manufacturing was concentrated in China. But rising wages, pandemic disruptions, and the US-China trade war pushed multinational firms to search for a second base. They wanted to diversify without leaving Asia's supply network. Vietnam became the natural answer. A company can still source parts from China, truck them across the border, assemble them in northern Vietnam, and export the finished goods globally. That allows firms to reduce tariff exposure and political risk without rebuilding their entire supply chain from scratch. Countries like India and Mexico have many strengths, but for China-linked Asian manufacturing, Vietnam's geography is hard to beat. That is the real meaning of China Plus One. It is not theory. It is factories moving, contracts shifting, and supply chains being physically redrawn. In 2025, Vietnam's exports rose by 17% to $475 billion. Foreign direct investment inflows reached about $27.6 billion. Some of the world's biggest tech companies are no longer just experimenting in Vietnam. They are expanding heavily. Apple significantly increased its spending with suppliers in Vietnam, reaching around 400 trillion dong, or roughly $16 billion. That investment reportedly supported around 200,000 local manufacturing jobs. Foxconn, one of the key contract manufacturers behind the iPhone, moved to expand mobile phone production capacity in Vietnam from 30 million units a year to 140 million. The company also sought approval to produce up to 4.8 million Xbox consoles per year in the country. Samsung Display committed $1.8 billion to an OLED screen plant in Bac Ninh. These are not small trial projects. These are signs that Vietnam is becoming deeply embedded in advanced electronics manufacturing. But a factory boom only works if logistics can keep up. High-volume electronics exports need roads, ports, airports, and industrial zones that function smoothly. You cannot build 140 million phones and then move them on weak highways or overcrowded freight routes. That is why expressway construction is treated almost like a national security issue. By the end of 2025, Vietnam expected to complete 3,188 kilometers of expressways, rising to 3,513 kilometers when major connector roads are included. That network is critical. It lets parts come in from China, flow into industrial parks, and then move to seaports or airports fast enough for just-in-time manufacturing. Air freight matters too, especially for high-value electronics. Vietnam's biggest new aviation project, Long Thanh International Airport near Ho Chi Minh City, is meant to ease pressure on overcapacity existing airports and become a major logistics hub. The government set a firm target for Long Thanh to begin commercial operations in the fourth quarter of 2026. It has been treated almost like a wartime deadline. Vietnam is also trying to strengthen its domestic economy, so it is not fully dependent on foreign demand. Retail sales rose by 9.2% in 2025. Inflation stayed relatively controlled at 3.31%. Average monthly income per person rose to about 5.9 million dong, up 9.3% from 2024. A growing middle class is buying more services, more transport, and more consumer goods. That matters because a healthier domestic economy gives Vietnam some cushion if export demand weakens. Still, the gap between the political target and likely reality remains obvious. Many analysts think 10% is unrealistic. The World Bank's forecasts sat far below that level. So why set such a high number if leadership knows the math is difficult? Because the 10% target is not only an economic forecast, it is a political tool. It is a forcing device. It gives the leadership justification to merge ministries, push bureaucrats to approve projects faster, and demand faster delivery from the state system. It replaces one fear with another. Instead of fearing the consequences of signing documents, officials are meant to fear failing the party's central mandate. It also gives cover for painful reforms. The state can tighten credit to property, push uncomfortable changes in power pricing, or demand administrative restructuring, all in the name of national growth. The target is not just a number, it is an instrument of state control designed to break inertia. But the 2026 economy will only be as strong as its weakest links, and Vietnam has three of them. The first is the electrical grid. No modern industrial strategy works without power. Vietnam learned that in June 2023, when severe blackouts hit the northern provinces. Factories shut down, assembly lines stopped, workers were left idle. For a country selling itself as a reliable production base for global electronics, this was a serious warning. The pressure has only grown since then. Electricity demand in 2025 was expected to rise by 10.5 to 13% from the year before. In a country moving toward electronics, industrial parks, and energy-heavy production, power demand can rise even faster than GDP. If Vietnam really chases 10% economic growth, the strain on the grid becomes enormous. In response, the state has rushed out emergency upgrades. One of the most important is the Quang Trach to Pho Noi 500 kilovolt Circuit 3 transmission line. It stretches 519 kilometers across 9 provinces and cost nearly $880 million. Its purpose is simple but vital. Move power from parts of the country where generation is stronger to the north, where industrial demand is greatest. But transmission lines do not create electricity. They only move it. And that leads to the deeper problem: generation. Vietnam's renewable energy sector became a warning case in policy instability. More than 170 renewable projects reportedly stalled because the government changed the rules around subsidies and payment rates. The original boom had been driven by feed-in tariffs, which guaranteed attractive prices for solar and wind developers. The policy worked. Investment poured in. But once officials worried that these contracts were becoming too expensive for the state utility, and once investigations into earlier approvals began, the government retroactively cut support rates. That is one of the worst things a state can do in infrastructure finance. Renewable projects are built using long-term debt models. Banks lend on the assumption that revenue rules will remain stable. If the government later cuts the price it will pay, the whole financing model can collapse. That is exactly what alarmed investors. By 2026, this had become a major legal and diplomatic problem. Foreign business groups warned that investors were considering legal action against Vietnam. The projects tied up in the dispute reportedly represented around 12 gigawatts of capacity. That is a huge amount of electricity for a country that badly needs more supply. So Vietnam's power problem is not only about engineering, it is also about trust. If investors do not trust the rules, they will not finance the next wave of generation. The second weak link is property. In fast-growing Asian economies, property often turns growth into financial risk. Easy money flows into real estate. Prices detach from incomes. Developers borrow heavily. Banks become exposed. When the bubble bursts, the damage spreads through the whole economy. Vietnam's leadership looked at China's property crisis and decided it did not want to repeat it. The strongest symbol of this crackdown was the case of real estate tycoon Truong My Lan. She was sentenced over a huge fraud case tied to Van Thin Phat Holdings and Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank. The message was unmistakable. The state would not tolerate financial excess and systemic fraud in the property sector. That had a strong chilling effect. In 2026, instead of trying to inflate growth through a new real estate boom, the State Bank of Vietnam cut its credit growth target to about 15%, down from around 20% the year before. Banks were told to tighten risk controls, especially for property lending. At the same time, the government began preparing tax measures aimed at reducing speculation after home prices reportedly surged by 20 to 30% in the previous year. This is careful long-term policy. The state wants money going into factories, technology, and infrastructure, not empty apartments and leveraged land bets. But in the short term, this also means Vietnam is deliberately choking off one of the traditional engines of fast GDP growth. Real estate booms are dangerous, but they can temporarily make economies look strong. Vietnam is choosing not to use that shortcut. The third weak link is the hardest to control: United States trade policy. Vietnam's economic rise depends heavily on selling goods to America. But that is exactly why Washington is watching it so closely. Vietnam imported $186 billion worth of goods from China, while exporting $153 billion to the United States. That trade pattern is the reason American officials suspect Vietnam is being used as a transshipment hub. The issue is value-added production. If Chinese parts come into Vietnam and are genuinely transformed there into a new product, that is legitimate manufacturing. But if goods are only lightly processed or relabeled before being shipped to the US, Washington may call that transshipment and hit them with tariffs. The problem is uncertainty. Exporters do not always know where the legal line really sits. A factory can invest heavily, hire workers, assemble products, and still face the risk that US customs decides the Vietnamese value-added content was not enough. If that happens and the 40% penalty tariff is applied, profit margins vanish instantly. Vietnam has responded by tightening enforcement. It has increased checks on origin fraud, stepped up inspections, and pushed customs officials to review the paperwork and movement of Chinese components more carefully. The country is trying to prove that it is a real manufacturing base, not a simple relabeling station.